One Turkish diplomat once told his European colleagues, "Our state is the strongest one. You are trying to make it collapse from the outside, while we are trying to make it collapse from the inside, and it's still not collapsing." And although the first part of the explanation is quite controversial, rather 50-50, because the Europeans in the 19th century, on the contrary, tried to avoid the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the formation of a power vacuum in its place, at the same time not hesitating to flirt with minorities. Everyone would agree with the second part. Not without reason, Turkey was called the sick man of Europe. One of the attempts to cure the state was the Tanzimat reforms, which didn't have the necessary effect, though. The empire continued its steady course to the bottom. But what if they had worked? Welcome to the Synthetic History channel, where we talk about events that didn't happen as if they did. And today I will tell the story of the Ottoman Empire return to its former greatness, using Victoria 3 with the Imperia Roleplay mod as a storytelling tool. 19th century. The Ottoman Empire, which had once inspired fear and terror in a third of the Old World and Europe in the first place, was clearly not having its best days, was only a shadow of its former power, and was gradually becoming an object of ridicule on the part of Europeans. However, it was not the decline of the empire that played an essential role there, although it also took place, which I will talk about later, but the growth of Europeans. While the latter were steadily marching along the road of progress, the Ottomans were stuck at the level of the 16th century. Attempts to modernize the state were made repeatedly, but were either insufficient or even harmful. Such inadvertently were the recent reforms of the Selim III at the turn of 18th and 19th centuries, which in 1807 ended in a mutiny of the Janissaries and a coup organized by reactionaries in the government, as a result of which Selim was removed from power and his nephew Mustafa was put on the throne. However, a year later there was a rebellion of counter-reactionaries, in which the latter was overthrown, but he had time to order Selim's assassination, so his younger brother Mahmud ascended the throne, whom he also wanted to kill to remain the only male member of the royal house, but didn't succeed. 6 months later, the Janissaries rebelled again, but Mahmud had time to kill Mustafa in order to remain the last Ottoman, and became untouchable. Pretty much that. What's my point? Such events are usually characteristic signs of a state weakening, and they were followed by its consequences. A presence of minorities, Greeks, Serbs, Wahhabis, Bosnians, and separatism of local governors, the most unpleasant of which was the de facto succession of Egypt under Muhammad Ali Pasha, who conquered Ottoman Syria during the First Turkish-Egyptian War of 1831-1833. But even that was not the worst thing. The Janissaries became simply unbearable. Coup after coup, mutiny after mutiny, corruption and debauchery. This empire was being built by their hands, bows and guns, but they had long since ceased to be allied troops, and to destroy it by their own hands it would be destroyed. Something had to be done about them, and by something, disbandment was meant. They still had a bit of decency though, since they didn't dare to interrupt the Ottoman dynasty, which would be their mistake. For a long time, Mahmud sat back and waited for the right moment, at the same time engaging in centralization. And after the successes of Muhammad Ali, then still more or less loyal to the Sultan, and his modernized Egyptian army in suppressing the Greek revolt in 1826, for which he by the way received the island of Crete, Mahmud began to create his own army on the European model, and began to recruit in it the most loyal and competent Janissaries, which caused discontent of the latter, and in the same year triggered them to another coup, for which this time the Sultan was ready. The Janissaries were defeated with the support of the population of Constantinople. The instigators were executed, and that episode entered Ottoman history literally as an event of fortune. Indeed, the fortune was great. So, the empire approached 1836 with a good level of centralization and a halfway modernized army. But you can't go far with an army alone. Sublime Porte needed major reforms in all spheres of governance, from economy to education, and the dissolution of the Janissaries shattered the status quo that had been established for centuries, and made the power of the Sultan and his government virtually unlimited. The road to modernization was open, And yet, Mahmud faced two other problems. The first was the lack of beneficiaries of the reforms. In Europe, these were the bourgeoisie, but in the Ottoman Empire they had not yet appeared. The second was the lack of connection between the center and the regions. Local landowners and officials, notables, being the richest people in the empire, could do anything, especially given the legalized corruption. Their salaries in fact were collected taxes and bribes, and the officials themselves were effectively feudal lords, often hereditary. Janissaries used to be such a link, but now they have vanished somehow. And without connection with the provinces and beneficiaries, reforms had all chances to remain on paper, signed in Constantinople, because no one will monitor the implementation of laws that are not favorable for themselves. It's like entrusting a cow with a slaughterhouse, or giving an oil company control over environmental tax rates. Something like that. In short, it was necessary to solve these problems. At the beginning, the beneficiary was the army, since its functioning required a whole bunch of things that needed to be reformed. Officers to be trained by a modernized education system, weapons and supplies to be produced by an industry that had not yet been created, money for salaries to be obtained from increased tax rates, and the proper administration that would transfer these taxes to the center rather than pocketing them. An army loyal to the Sultan could also impose his will in the simplest way, by force, replacing local administrations with military ones. But such a simple method had a significant disadvantage. You basically turn your own lands into occupied ones, causing obvious discontent among the population. The alternative was the creation of the Mejlis, an analog of the House of Lords, proposed by Mustafa Rashid Pasha, an ambassador who had recently returned from London and Paris and had seen the local state structures, and who became the unofficial leader of the educated bureaucracy. The senators in the Mejlis were the very local landowners, and although the parliament didn't have much power, since the Sultan's decrees had more weight than the Mejlis decisions, it legitimized the government's future actions to a certain extent. Soon, Mustafa prepared a package of further necessary reforms. Mahmud approved them and appointed him Grand Vizier, head of the government. The Imperial Edict of Reorganization was published in the name of the Sultan, containing the main objectives of the reforms: to ensure security of life, honor and property for all subjects of the empire, regardless of religion affiliation, the proper distribution and collection of taxes, regularization of recruitment, and the shortening of military service, which was proclaimed in Gulhan, Rose House, for which it was named. This is where the era of Tanzimat begins, translated as reorganization. And as I said, just about everything had to be reorganized. And while all these promises in the edict sounded cool and modern, you know, human rights, freedoms, equality, all that stuff, the area of primary importance for reform was the declining economy, and industrialization in particular. From the beginning of the 19th century, there was a decline in production in the major industries of cotton, cloth, silk, and metalworking. Thus, for the first 40 years of the 19th century, the production of fabrics in Bursa and Diyarbakir decreased 10 times. And the main reason was, as it's easy to guess, cheap and often more qualitative imported goods from Europe, first of all Britain, as well as narrowing of production base, as agricultural products were exported to Europe. If the situation was left to its own devices, Turkey was in danger of becoming a source of raw materials and a market for Europeans, and therefore the need for change was quite high. And to get out of this situation, industrialization was needed, so that imported goods would compete not with manufacturing goods, but with factory-made ones, so that everything would be fair, I would say. However, to build factories and purchase equipment, they needed money. Moreover, state money, because the landowning elites were not interested in investing in industry, and the weak class of merchants simply did not have the resources for such things, because it was quite a lot of money. But the state didn't have enough after the modernization of the army. There were two ways to get them. One of them was right, and the other was not so good. The first was crediting from Europe and increasing agricultural exports to pay off the debt in the process of industrialization, until the factories begin to self-sustain. And the second was to raise taxes and custom duties to the sky, thus transferring the burden of progress to the peasants. As history has shown, the latter option turned out to be correct, despite its seeming rigidity, because the former made the country hostage to foreign capital and trade, which would have given the Europeans additional leverage, because they would have determined prices and duties and inevitably would have made the empire even more like a raw materials appendage, and in addition would have increased the influence of landowners, who are responsible for the production of raw materials. At the time, however, it was not clear which of the options was correct. The world system with its core and periphery had not yet been invented, and examples of unsuccessful industrialization of Latin American countries had not yet appeared. There was a third option, to attract investors with cheap labor, but this option began to work normally only after 100 years, when the Europeans and Americans ran out of their own peasants. So, the Ottomans decided to rely on taxes. In order to increase tax collections, besides the obvious way, which is a simple increase in the rate up to 50%, which has already been done, and centralization, that is, the elimination of autonomies, which increase the numbers of taxpayers, you can still increase the efficiency of their collection, which meant reducing corruption. Since 1839, the Ottoman printed currency, the lira, was put into circulation, and the Ministry of Finance was created in the manner of the French one. Together with its emergence was carried out a tax reform, according to which all paid a single per capita tax, thus simultaneously increasing revenue and not much annoying the nobility, as they in percentage terms paid less than the peasants, though the state would still have to irritate them, because the next two reforms in the package hit them directly. To reduce corruption, the old systems of selling tax collection rights to the nobility and transferring positions by inheritance were abolished, and instead, government-appointed officials and tax collectors arrived in the regions, receiving salaries and obliged to keep strict financial records. And to prevent landowners from corrupting them, their financial base was hit with a land reform. The situation with the land in the Ottoman Empire was quite fascinating. About 1/3 of the total land fund belonged to landowners and clergy, and the rest formally belonged to the state. Indeed, it was formally owned. In reality, these lands were often under little control of the state. They were either granted for temporary, but in reality permanent use to the nobility for their ancestors' long-standing merits, or they were just brazenly occupied by someone, usually also by the nobility, or they were abandoned altogether. Tenant peasants worked on these lands. Not serfs, of course, but nevertheless they had right only to live. De facto these were feudal practices, and the efficiency of such management was corresponding. The reform was designed to put an end to them. Those who worked on the land from this state fund became its new owners, with full property rights. And the all imperial cadastral surveys and censuses carried out under this reform made the division of land relatively fair. And at the same time, peasants now certainly could not hide from taxes. This reform also stirred up capitalist movements among peasants. Some of them failed to handle management and were forced to sell their land, often quite cheaply, as everyone had it now, and go to the city in search of a better life. And some, on the contrary, began to earn money from the sale of crops and increase their allotment by buying land from their loser neighbors, while hiring them as laborers, and introducing new agrarian technologies. The peasants who worked for the nobles, who officially owned the land, were most unlucky. They got nothing. But whatever, land, as I said, was cheap back then. For even greater stimulation of competition in the favor of development of the industry, there were changes in the trade policy of the state. On all imported goods were imposed high duties, especially on those with high added value: fabrics, clothing, glass and metal products, and so on. Also, high duties were imposed on exports of low value added goods: raw silk, dyes, grains, leather, wool. Protectionism with a few extra steps, although in fact it could be called isolationism, with windows. Landowners were forced to sell their produce cheaper, and the state began sponsoring infrastructure projects to connect the countryside to the city. And under the new favorable conditions for industrial development, landowners and wealthy merchants themselves became more involved. By the way, a funny but important change was also made in the assignment of duties. According to Ottoman practice at the time, goods derived their taxable status from the nationality of the merchant, not from the place of production. This in turn created an imbalance in prices. Imported Russian grain was charged a third of the duty imposed on Ottoman domestic grain. American tobacco could be purchased at a better price in Alexandria, and Swiss silk was cheapest in Lebanon. Naturally, this practice was changed to the usual Western one, and Americans or Swiss could now easily become merchants in the empire, if they wanted to. All the previous reforms helped to create a good financial base for industrialization and further development of the state. Tax revenues from 1836 to 1848 more than doubled. Also, corruption was significantly reduced and the influence of the nobility was shaken. Their opinion on these issues, as we know, was forgotten to be asked. Members of the Majlis were convinced, by money or force, in the need of tough reforms, and the army was already on the side of the Sultan. The next reform was the end of its modernization. Universal conscription was introduced for Muslims as well as non-Muslims, along with the abolition of jizya, a tax for the latter, and the term of service in the army was reduced from 15 to 4 years. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be drafted for 15 years. 4 years either. Anyway, the army in the empire became regular and modern. Also, the military reform introduced new, more comfortable and modern military uniforms, and the military industry built beforehand covered most of the army's needs. The renewed army was able to prove itself quite soon, in the Second Turkish-Egyptian War. During this time, the following episode occurred in the relations between them. In 1840, Muhammad Ali, dissatisfied with the results of the previous war, demanded from the Sultan to give him full control over Cilicia. Since the Ottoman army was not yet ready for war, the Sultan gritted his teeth and met his demands on the advice of the court. Realizing that the Ottomans were not going to resist, the former declared Egypt's independence. In fact, the port lost almost nothing in this situation. Sanjak-Isel, which was transferred to Egypt, was small, and the independence of Egypt did not change anything in the political sense. They were not sending tribute regardless. And by the next war, the balance of power between them changed dramatically. Remember what I said about the two ways of industrialization? Hope you do. So, Egypt went the first way, with all the associated problems. First of all, a large national debt. The situation for them was aggravated by the army. It was big and expensive, too big for the Egyptian economy. And Muhammad Ali was afraid to reduce its size, because he expected confrontation with the empire. He didn't get a chance to fight a new war, though, having died in 1849. And it began 3 years later. The Sultan demanded from the new ruler of Egypt, Ibrahim Pasha, to return under direct control of the empire all lands north or east of the Sinai Peninsula, including Crete, to reduce the army to 50,000 people, as well as to come to Constantinople and swear allegiance to the Sultan. Such demands by Ibrahim, as a former general and commander-in-chief in the First Turkish-Egyptian War, then 6 days' walk from Constantinople. The empire was then saved by Muhammad Ali's indecision and the entry of Russia into the war on the side of the Turks. You never guess who will come to your aid. Were perceived as absurd, and he began to prepare for war. And in vain. During the first battles, Egyptian army was almost totally defeated in Syria and Tripolitania, and was forced to constantly retreat. In the summer, the Turks entered Cairo, and a year later, Egypt capitulated. In addition to the demands already made, Ibrahim Pasha and other generals were executed, and an Egyptian loyal to the Sultan from the government, Fevzi Farid, was appointed Khedive of Egypt. This rather easy victory, achieved by the Ottomans on their own, showed Europeans that the empire could still, or rather could already stand up for itself, and that separatist movements would be successfully and brutally suppressed. The empire would live on. Mahmud II died in August 1859, at the age of 74. In more than 50 years of his reign, he had accomplished much, having managed to carry out the most important and most difficult changes, requiring a hard hand, so to speak. And it was good, at least for Ottomans, because his son, the next Sultan Abdul Majid, was much softer and had his own views on the development of the state. Under him, the second phase of Tanzimat began, distinguished from the previous one by liberal reforms. The first thing he did was to ban slavery. There were relatively few slaves in the empire after the cease of the Crimean and Berber slave trade, except in some areas like Crete, where African slaves made up to 20% of the population. But it was an important symbolic step for the next one, introducing Ottomanism. As I mentioned, the empire back then was largely held together by force. But another important element in maintaining loyalty was the millets. Roughly speaking, they were groups of communities linked by religion, which lived according to their own laws, were quite autonomous, and were located in specified places, quarters of cities or just villages. Different millets had their own rights, duties or restrictions, from certain colors of clothing to the prohibition of horseback riding. In this system, although it reduced public discontent by preventing different religions from interacting with each other, the disadvantages of fragmentation were clearly greater than the advantages, from economic to legal. Another disadvantage was that the millets were organized on religious basis, which at the moment of development and spread of the concept of nationalism began to lead to friction on this ground. Slavs, for example, were dissatisfied with the overrepresentation of Greeks in Orthodox religious posts, and this while Greece was independent. And the Ottomanism was supposed to solve these problems. In 1860, the Imperial Reform Edict, Islahat Fermani, was issued, which aimed to equalize the rights of all the inhabitants of the empire, as well as to create a super nation of Ottomans, such as first of all you are an Ottoman, and then Serb, Arab or Kurd. That's what Ottomanism was all about. Such large-scale transformations are not solved by issuing one edict, so let's talk about all the changes in order. First, the Ottoman nationality law was adopted, which created a common Ottoman citizenship irrespective of religious or ethnic affiliation. Then changes were made in the parliament. There was created a new chamber, the House of Deputies, the members of which were elected. The voters were men of any confession and nationality who passed a very high property threshold. For a population of 25 million, there were 200,000 voters. But they already had a noticeable influence on state policy. Most of these voters were either indifferent to the reforms or were generally against them, though. And so the Sultan and his entourage went for a trick. In 1862, creating the Ottoman constitution, presented it as given to the first assembly of deputies who had not yet formed parties. The idea was that the Sultan wouldn't have the right to abolish the constitution. He could only appoint ministers, dissolve parliament and other minor actions like declaring war. And parliament needed 2/3 of votes to change the constitution, which was almost impossible for the reactionaries to get. So the constitution, being the last product of absolutism, became a wall blocking the country's way back. Moreover, the constitution, as a logical continuation of the Reform Edict, was very liberal and modern, and included almost all the changes Abdul Hamid wanted to make. The rights and duties of communities were replaced by individual ones. Rights of assembly, property, education, and so on. And the state was separated from the church, which meant the abolition of Sharia and millets, and with them the rights and duties of various religions. The next step was the realization of what was written in this constitution, that is, the creation of secular state. In the beginning, it was necessary to brutally suppress the clashes between Muslims and Christians, because they came into contact with each other much more often after the abolition of the millets. And the problem of intolerance had to be solved in the minds, for which schools and universities are best suited. Like if you had been in contact with representatives of other religions since childhood, you will treat them better too. The main thing here is to prevent the formation of analogues of millets inside schools and classes. Anyway, before the reforms, education was an exclusive sphere of activity of ulema, Islamic scholars, and the education there was appropriate to the purpose, teaching Islam, which for a long time was actually quite good. There are literacy and mathematics and other sciences to choose from, but for the new needs associated with industrialization, they were not very suitable, both in terms of disciplines and scale. Therefore, the first steps in the development of public education were taken under Mahmud, but at the time the focus was rather on secondary and higher educational institutions, which trained officials, engineers and military personnel according to the Western model, as well as on sending students to Europe for training. This was done in order to feed the increasing administrative needs of the state with personnel. In general, it was not yet a question of systematic mass education. and the new education was provided to students from more or less wealthy families. Then, from the middle of the 19th century, the state was able to provide money for the education of the lower strata of the population, and the first free public elementary schools began to appear, which, however, were still aimed mainly at educating future officers and officials loyal to the state. And here we come to the education reform of 1866, when schools began to become really common, though not compulsory for attendance for a long time yet. But they did their job well, raising literacy to 85% by the next century, and reducing religious tensions in society. Schools also became a key place for the promotion of Ottomanism, which under the cover of equality of peoples and religions of the empire was a soft Turkization of the population. It is quite reasonable. If you want to make a state of equal rights out of the empire and unite people in the state on some principle, then a good option would be to make all people the representatives of one nation, or at least to make everyone know one language. And Turks as a state-forming nation and Turkish as their language were an obvious choice. A nation starts with language, and it has accordingly become the main focus of the Ottomanization program. Every citizen must know the state language. Ottoman Turkish, the language used by then administration and the ulema, which was in fact an artificial language containing more than half Arabic and Persian words, was transformed into the literary New Ottoman, quite close to the then colloquial Turkish with the addition of borrowings from English and French for new terms. It was the language that became compulsory in schools. Local languages were optional, and little non-religious literature was printed in them, as the state sponsored only literature in the New Ottoman language. And local elites, especially Asian ones, didn't realize its importance at the time. So it turned out that school attendance was higher in the Turkish provinces, and the literacy rate there was almost 1.5 times higher than the average imperial one. It's easier to learn a language you speak than an unknown one, after all. Because of this, Turks were more educated, and they were appointed more often to important positions throughout the empire, such as engineers in new factories, professors and teachers in new educational institutions. Add to this the fact that 80% of the voters, thus the richest people, were Turks, and you get the conclusion that it seemed to be more profitable to be a Turk in the empire, and thus their relative numbers grew. For example, in the 1852 census, 12.5% of the population of the Baghdad Vilayet called themselves Turks, and 30 years later, the number had risen to 28.5%. The growth is eye-popping, to be honest. That's not sarcasm, if anyone doesn't get it. So Ottomanism as an idea of assimilation has proven to work very well, unfortunately for the rest of the peoples of the empire. But let's get back to foreign policy. In 1863, Greece, with secret Russian support, demanded islands in the agency from Turkey, citing the terrible treatment of the local Greek population. Expecting an obvious negative response, because here's Greece and here is the Ottoman Empire, they began to prepare for a war to liberate the territories with a majority Greek population. Russia itself pursued two goals in this war: to weaken the growing power of the southern neighbor, plus to show its strength in the region. Plus it would be nice to liberate the brothers in faith, Constantinople to return, Byzantium to restore, and other rents. In the Ottoman Empire, allies were also not averse to destroy the status quo and show the achievements of the past modernization. They were openly supported by Great Britain because they sort of had an alliance, so it looked like the forces were equal. But Russia assumed that on land it had an overwhelming advantage, which was actually true, as their army was more than twice as large as the Turkish. They even managed to somehow stealthily transfer 200,000 soldiers plus equipment to Greece, through the Bosphorus. So, the war began in August with the attack of Greek-Russian troops and was fought on three fronts: Bessarabian, Caucasian and Greek. The greatest success Russia had on the latter, not without reason there was half of their army. And before the arrival of the British troops there, they crushed the Turks, though not enough to fulfill the main goal of the war, namely the capture of Constantinople. So the war dragged on. The Ottoman army was mostly concentrated in the Caucasus, because its recapture was their main goal in the future confrontation with Russia after the war of 1828-29. At the beginning of the war there was a parity of forces. Due to this there were the bloodiest battles. On the Bessarabian front, the parties, strangely enough, almost didn't fight, although it would seem that the open terrain was most suitable for it. This was the balance of power for the first half of the war. Russia generally had the advantage. Yet, gradually their main enemy, logistics, made itself known, shifting the balance of power towards Turkey. In any case, it is surprising how they managed to supply their army in Greece for 1.5 years, with the sea completely blocked and the fleet destroyed at the beginning of the war. And it was not the easiest task to supply the army in the Caucasus. In addition, they simply ran out of money and began to get into debt, because industrialization there was sluggish, and therefore they couldn't keep the army in good condition for a long time. The Turkish-British side could easily supply the army by sea and through the railroad network that was being laid at the time, and they obviously had more funds for the war. The turning point came in 1865, when Russia declared bankruptcy and ran out of supplies. Within a year, all fronts collapsed and the Turkish army confidently occupied the Caucasus and marched on the Crimea. They planned to return to themselves almost all coast of the Black and Azov Seas, and also Greece was under threat, although the Turkish troops stood at the time in 300 kilometers from the Greek borders. But the further advance of the troops was prevented by Britain and Austria, who didn't want to further shift the balance of power in the region, and forced the parties to sit down at the negotiations table. As a result, Russia recognized the Ottoman Empire's authority over all lands south of the Great Caucasus, and Greece got away with only small reparations. The Ottoman government itself was dissatisfied with the outcome of the war, but could do nothing. At least they were able to convince Abdul Majid to abolish the dependent Kurdish principalities, which were conquered by Mahmud in 1834. They managed to raise a united rebellion, but were defeated by the army returning from the Caucasus front, and were turned into an ordinary province. The elimination of large autonomies and vassals in general was the next goal of the state, under the next Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the second son of Abdul Majid, who came to the throne in 1870. And at this point, the Tanzimat era ends. The new ruler was, if I may say so, a test for the state system built under his father, for he was almost his opposite, at least in terms of state building. He sought to restore the old orders, to restore absolute monarchy, to remove secularism, and so on. A reactionary, in a word. He dissolved the parliament twice, and under him, the strict suppression of interreligious conflicts became rather a suppression of Christians and Jews only. It didn't come to the open aggression of the army, but the Sultan's sympathies for Muslims were obvious. However, the constitutional system survived the ordeal. It had its supporters in the form of industrialists and Christian officials who had gained political weight, and the majority of the elites simply didn't want to break something that had proven itself. The solution of parliament could only be done once a year, so it did almost nothing but delay its operation. And so the new sultan had no choice but to direct his autocratic fervor towards the liquidation of autonomies. The first in line was the Caucasus, which until then had been administered by a military governor, so nothing interesting happened there. Next was Egypt, which always had a rather high share of autonomy in the empire, and the elites there were more cohesive. And therefore, in response to this news, a rebellion broke out there. The local sheikhs clearly didn't want to give up power and observe secularization. However, after the reduction of the army, Egypt didn't represent the former threat, and therefore was quickly occupied and fragmented into 10 default Ottoman provinces, vilayets, which however for a couple of years were governed by the civil-military administration. Then it was the turn of Danubian and Tripolitanian vilayets, which didn't resist at all. When the autonomies were over, the Turks started a war against Persia, justifying it by Turkic pan-nationalism. The northwest of Persia was inhabited by Azerbaijanis, the closest Turkic people to the Turks by language, and since half of them had already been liberated from Russia, it would be good to liberate the other half. Persia was also modernizing, although not so successful, so the Ottoman army could not achieve a crushing victory. The Persians even defended well at first, but during a year of fighting, they lost the most combat-ready units and were forced to give up the lands inhabited by Azerbaijanis. Abdul Hamid also had time to fight against Europeans, namely against the French, taking part in the new war against the latter on the side of Great Britain. The reason for the war was the inability to agree on the division of borders in West Africa, where the colonial race had just begun. and initially it looked like an ordinary skirmish between colonial troops in Senegal, but then it turned into a rather long war for dominance in the region. The Ottomans had two objectives here: to regain control of Algeria, which had been taken away by the French back in 1830, and also to show the power of the Turkish army over those who had essentially been role models in the reforms of Selim III and Tanzimat. And they concluded that they needed to modernize still, at least militarily, because the French navy defeated the Ottomans, and their army repulsed the latter's attempts to land in Algeria with the support of the British navy. The British also failed to land, but their fleet was several times more powerful than the French, and took France in a blockade. As a result of bloody battles for 2.5 years, total losses amounted to about 500,000 people, which for a colonial war was obscenely high. The parties agreed on peace without any conditions. Turkey didn't lose much in this war. The main loss was a shattered fleet, but it still had mostly obsolete wooden steamers by that point, so it needed to be rebuilt. And they would soon need the fleet more than usual, because during the war, construction of the canal was started on the isthmus of Suez. It's hard to overstate the importance of the canal to the empire, and here's why. The states in this region had been intermediaries in trade between Europe and Asia since the founding of the Roman Empire, and had profited handsomely from it. But once a sea road through Africa was opened, the previous roads became redundant, and the Ottoman Empire lost leverage over Europe and money from tolls. But after the canal was dug almost 4 centuries after that discovery, the Ottoman Empire again became the owner of the highest priority road, and thus an intermediate point in the transportation of goods. The canal also offered opportunities for better control of the Arabian Peninsula, expansion into East Africa and Persia, and also had the symbolic significance of being a major engineering project carried out exclusively by Turkish efforts. The military navy, in turn, is obviously needed most where the civilian navy is, and so it needed modernization and expansion. However, this is material for another story, and this story will end here, because after a bunch of updates the game is crashing on my save, which of course upset me. I may well do a sequel, though I'd have to rerun the game to do it, but if this video succeeds, I'll do it. You can influence the result by liking, commenting and subscribing to the channel, in case you forgot about it. And many thanks to the patrons who contributed to this video. Here there are. You can join them too, by the way. These guys, for example, chose what the next video will be about. And with that, I bid you farewell.